Welcome back to another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. My name is Patrick Lyons. I'm one of your co-hosts, just one of three really awesome people, or at least two awesome people and me. One of those awesome people is my friend for, 7 years now? Patsy, is that how long we've known each other?
I'm happy to say, yes, that's accurate.
7 years. It's been two of the best years of your life. Welcome back today. And of course, that third awesome person, Leb Tannenbaum. Leb, welcome back to you. I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce our guest.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, very excited. So today's guest is Jesse Andrew Clark. He is a filmmaker. When Jesse was 11 years old, get this, listeners, he was 11 years old. He asked for an interview Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. He is a graduate of UC Santa Cruz in film production. Jesse is an award-winning filmmaker, and his film, co-directed with Shane Anderson, Chehalis, A Watershed Moment, has been aired on PBS. I was originally going to say 15 states, now I'm going to say 28 states. So check it out. Jesse focuses these days on the broad category of environmental health and the impact that we're all having in terms of the people and the planet that we all live on. He is recognized, and he recognizes that there's a driving force in companies, CEOs, as you're listening, impacting, food sourcing, impacting the planet, impacting people. And to kind of kick it off, Jesse said to me when we were talking, what we do to each other, we do to the planet, and vice versa. And Jesse, I want to let you know we're really excited to get into this with you, and I thought maybe you could expand on that for our listeners.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Leb, and thank you again, Patrick and Patsy. Really excited to be here today. Appreciate you taking the time. So yeah, what we do to the planet is what we do to each other, and vice versa. I might have gotten that backwards from what you said, but it goes both ways, and I think a core belief, a driving belief for what I do in the world is kind of revolves around that. And so the way that we hold each other's relationships, the way that we hold our relationship with, with each other, whether it's in work or play or whatever part of life, I think that also shows up in the ways that we treat the planet. It comes down to worldview and culture, and how we kind of how we're intertwined with these natural resources of the earth that we inhabit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. So, kind of coming off of that, we started to talk about, leaders, and started to talk about, obviously, frustrated CEOs, about CEOs. And if we, work in the space of that, the CEOs, part of the role is to set direction. We've come through so much change in the last 3 years, but you're looking at healthy people, healthy planet. Any thoughts on what you've been seeing through the lens of filmmaking that you want to share with us?
In terms of the changes of the last few years, or?
Yeah, and what it takes to be a leader, or where a leader might be frustrated in setting direction.
Sure.
Changing the workforce, et cetera.
I will speak for myself in saying that, and there's a quote I heard that I really love, which is that leadership comes from nowhere. And I heard that one time. It really struck me, and I think it's true. It's, especially being a documentary filmmaker and being an independent filmmaker, there's nobody really saying this is what you should be doing with your life, except, obviously I have a great group of filmmakers I work with, and lots of, friends and family supporting me. But at the end of the day, it's my own motivation and passion that's going to drive what I do. So, so I'm asking myself why I do what I do, it's a matter of the commitments I've made, beyond filmmaking, beyond sort of being a technician or being a leader. It's sort of the intrinsic values that I hold as a person on the planet, which is don't trash your backyard. And we only have one planet to work with as far as we know. Others have other ideas about that. But, I think we have a lot of work to do culturally to bring our business world in alignment with our natural world. And so my privilege in carrying a camera around the world is that I get to point that camera and tell stories to people and show them the relationships that exist that may not be so evident if we're just kind of giving them a quick glance.
That's good. That's good. Well, we've had 2 episodes with previous guests who talked about storytelling, and you're in the business of doing that through documentaries and film, and you talk about being behind the lens. Given what's happening, and if I'm running a business, what are some of the stories I need to examine or listen to or learn that maybe aren't in the mainstream of the way I currently think or believe?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't work in not necessarily a tangible industry, you could say. What we do is sort of digital these days, but I think one thing that comes to mind is sort of, if you're working in a tangible medium in terms of manufacturing, or you're creating a good in the world, just basic things like being very aware about where these resources are coming from, how they're being sourced. This is basic talk these days, but it's important stuff, and we're entering into a time when we're considering new energy supply chains, and we're, frankly, supply chains of every kind, So thinking about where we're getting resources from, how those are being harvested, what are the relationships, both human and natural, at those places where they're being extracted. And plastic comes to mind, right? I mean, all this single-use plastic stuff, it's floating in the ocean, it's taking over the world. So, that's sort of like on a material level, that's one thing to be aware of. On a resource level, because as humans, we've done a really, really great job of extracting lots of things out of the earth and using them and turning them into goods and shipping them all over the world, but certainly at some costs to our natural world. And so, that's the thing. I'm, of course, not to beat a dead horse, but that's always what I'm coming back to with my driving philosophy is, how can we really live on this planet in a way that's gonna allow us to thrive for many, many generations, and not necessarily turn a short-term profit.
Jesse, can you tell us about the documentary? It's obviously doing well, right? What was the motivation for it, and what's the story? Go.
Yeah, you're referring to Chehalis, the Chehalis documentary?
Yes.
Yeah. So that started as I work with other filmmaker Shane Anderson, who's based in Olympia. I'm based in Oregon, and about 3 years ago, he brought to my attention that there's another dam proposal on a river in Washington. It happened to be one of the last free-flowing rivers in Washington, actually. And so, if you live in the Pacific Northwest, you know that salmon are incredibly important to everybody here. Certainly to tribal cultures and tribal people, to fishermen of any type here, and just as a cultural icon, salmon is inseparable from the Pacific Northwest. And so it is a known sort of scientific fact that a lot of the last good salmon runs in the world have been lost due to placing dams on these wild rivers that salmon need to be free flowing, because they migrate from the ocean to the freshwater each life cycle. So Shane brought to me this proposal, and he's like, hey, they're thinking about building this dam up there, and there's some, it's mainly for flood control. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's investigate. And so when I first met up with Shane, actually, we had a totally different film planned, but as life goes, this was in the news. It was in his hometown. He's an avid salmon fisherman and had seen these rivers like the Chehalis River decline for years and years in terms of population. And so he said, well, I really want to do something. And it began as a 15-minute film, and then it was maybe a 30-minute film, and then we said, well, there's actually something deeper here. So we began sort of a 2-year investigative journey through the Chehalis Basin, the watershed, to discover sort of, all right, what are the prevailing opinions here? What are the conflicts? What are the stakeholders? And, sort of document to the public and just distill down this incredibly esoteric body of knowledge, which is stacks of environmental reports and legislative topics and stuff that is not great bedtime reading. But to take that all and put it into an entertaining package to where people go, oh, I understand what's happening now, and even get a little bit of a entertaining kick out of it. So, we were interviewing people who were pro dam and people who were against the dam. A lot of the more environmental anti-dam efforts were led by the Chehalis tribe in Washington. And so it was, sort of trying to be a balanced look at what are the arguments on both sides. And ultimately, and people can, of course, form their own opinions after watching the film. But my personal opinion after, the deluge of research and everything and making the movie and talking to everyone was that, there were some people that were willing to trade this incredibly iconic creature for protecting, several hundred homes in a flood valley that floods every single year and has since the beginning of time. So, sort of when it comes down to cost benefit analysis, I don't think it made sense. So,
yeah. So thank you. What's interesting, I would imagine what you talked about, the deluge of information, the difference of opinions. I would imagine that same kind of conflict exists within businesses today, right? You've got organizations that are trying to make decisions that are, in some ways, maybe they're customer driven or they're financially driven. Maybe it's all the same thing, and yet have an impact on the environment. And so, what can you take away from that a listener can, if a frustrated CEO can figure out, how do I, if I have to break the tie, if I have to be the one to ultimately make the decision? I mean, it's hard. It's hard these days, right? To your point, to make that decision. Someone might be listening. You, having done the film, you might be thinking that's not hard at all. It's this iconic creature, and it's homes. But there's how do you navigate through that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the core conflict. That wasn't necessarily dams versus no dam. It was people with a seat at the table and people who had not been given a seat at the table. And so, of course, a lot of indigenous communities fell under that latter umbrella. But I think some of the leadership mistakes that were made by city government, county government, state government around that process had to do with not having all the stakeholders at the table. And we're talking the very people that have relied on and survived because of this river for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So, so to deny certain tribal voices or other voices, even just homeowners or, a seat at the table was just kind of poor. That was poor leadership, in my opinion, because there's a lot to be learned from every single perspective. And there's a lot of things that are kind of taken for granted and maybe just overlooked. So I think that was sort of the big takeaway from that. And believe you me, we gave everyone a seat at the table in the film. We counted later. There were 39 people that showed up in interviews in the movie. That's just the people who were interviewed, and many more in the background. So, we thought, okay, well, maybe we don't do another 40 character film again, but people definitely, I think, resonated with how much we let the players frame the debate on all sides. There was no narration to steer the opinion. Did we make the final decision as to whether the dam got built? No, we didn't. But I feel like we presented the film in a way that would lead people who paid attention to understand really what was at stake there. So,
That was a great answer. Thank you. Not that I'm in the business of grading your answers, I promise. It was, to me, that is a great takeaway for the CEO is in these complex decisions, it really is about making sure that that all the stakeholders have a voice, that everybody has a seat at the table.
And I would say even more than just making sure they get a voice, but like inherently placing a lot of trust in those voices. People are coming to the table with whatever concern is, whether it's environmental, whether it's city planning, whether it's planning a company or a business plan, or what you're going to give, what percentage you're going to give back to the planet, sort of thing. I think it's all relevant to value each and every voice. And of course, then it comes time to make a decision, and that's the hardest part, right? So,
right.
But that's the inside job, I think.
Has the decision? Oh, go ahead, Betsy. Go for it.
Well, I have a kind of another component of the question Patrick asked, and so that is what I'm hearing you say is take a more systems perspective. Be willing to look at the bigger picture, both what's coming into my company and what's going out of my company. And so many of our listeners may be, and it's kind of classic, certainly American business, to focus on the bottom line.
Yes.
So what are some real practical steps for CEOs or anybody listening to start to say, how do I start to take a little bit bigger perspective, a systems perspective, and what new tools I need? I hear you talk a lot about curiosity, or that's what I hear. You have an inquiring mind.
I do, yeah, and I think that's helpful for entertaining different stakeholder voices. But as far as can you ask that again? Sorry.
Yeah, for anybody listening, our tendency is to focus on the bottom line. To get really clear and finite. What you're really inviting people to do is take more of a systems perspective. Yeah,
and certainly, in our own profit model or lack of profit model, it's documentary filmmaking is not very profitable, so it's the dollar is sort of almost last in what we're doing. It's like get the message out at any cost. So ideas like the triple bottom line has really been coming in the last decade or so, and people planet profit and kind of shifting the priorities of things, or like just kind of broadening their values of what value is. Broadening the definition of value, to more human values, to more environmental values. I feel like I'm striking out here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
I guess other tools in terms of just redefining the value of the business. It's like you have to, I think a leader has to ask themselves if they really are trying to impact the world, and take a long, hard look at if they're trying to make the world a better place, or if they're trying to sort of line their pockets, and if there's ego involved with that, but I don't know.
I'm kind of with you on this, Jesse, because I think another way that we're starting to see some leaders talk about, maybe take more responsibility, is there's a lot of people exiting and retiring. They're at a certain age where they're ready to exit, they're ready to retire. Maybe they're still a business leader, maybe they're a CEO, maybe they're an owner, founder, president, whatever the case may be, but they're talking more about their grandchildren, and so there is a way to kind of step out from me, myself, and I, and the people that work in my company right now, and skip a generation or two.
Definitely. Yeah. This is
stretch that thinking out, and because what they're saying, to us in meetings is, gosh, I'm really, I want to leave a good place for my grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that, I have a trust fund and they're going to get money, because that's not necessarily going to matter if we really screw it up.
Exactly. Yeah. So back to kind of what you're saying, Patsy, like I guess one of those tools maybe to add to the tool belt is sort of a longer timeline, a longer clock, a longer temporal thinking, like Leb is saying, in terms of, okay, am I doing everything I can right now to make my quarter one profit margin or whatever, or am I looking to, 7 years, 7 generations, 100 generations, certainly grandchildren or just children seeing a world after you're gone or thinking about that is enough to wonder, okay, what am I leaving, and to consider the impacts downstream, the downstream impacts of, maybe I'm making some money right now or I'm doing something good for the company's growth, but what am I kicking the can down the road? Or what can am I kicking down the road to the younger generation? And certainly, you look at all the climate stuff going around, and that's a pretty big can that, your generation, my generation, my children's generation are going to have to contend with, and on into the future. Who knows how long this ride is. So, I would say longer timeline is definitely powerful in my own thinking. It's helped me in my own leadership. Which also goes to, can help with good storytelling too, because you're trying to make a more timeless message sometimes, and more timeless culture and story. So,
yeah, it's good. So when you're behind the lens and you've got 39 interviews going on with people sharing from all these different perspectives, really, right? And they have a story, right? They have a story. How do you keep yourself from getting triggered by something that you have to listen to and film, where you're like, dang, no, but you're an artist, you're a storyteller, how do you stay true to the art? Because I think that's partially what the challenge is to every CEO and leader. How do I stay true to myself, or true to, what matters?
Yeah.
When there's all these other, maybe it's a public company and there's shareholders and they're saying, well, we want profit. And then, you've got, your HR person saying, we need a healthier culture so we can attract and retain people. And here you are, and you're documenting maybe if you could, like when you're 11, when you meet Steve there, what if we documented the growth of Apple, and you'd see all of these, different perspectives and people, and what we're gonna disrupt the whole music industry. Well, why would we do that, and what does that mean, to other people?
Sure.
And how do you? Well, maybe there's something there, that's going to really help a listener.
I think for me personally, going into any interview, even if it's someone I know I disagree with largely, I think just starting with common ground and building up from absolute scratch, which would look something like, okay, this person has a family. I have a family. They want to have a roof over their head and provide for that family. I want to have a roof over my head and provide for my family. Okay, great. Oh, we agree. Okay, great. We all agree economics is important. We all agree having a meaningful job in the world is important. We all agree being able to take care of kids is important. Okay, we agree, right? And it's not going to be all rosy from there, but starting on common ground, building from common ground, seeing where the bifurcations occur in the conversation and thinking, and really trying to keep the curious mind active, even if it's something that makes my gut wrench, potentially, keeping the curiosity, because when somebody says something and tells me their convictions, I believe them. In an interview, I'm going to believe that person in that interview, and I'm going to take them seriously and give them the benefit of the doubt, and be a little bit vulnerable, So I think that can kind of take down some of the stereotypes that exist and let the deeper conversation come into play. Because the driving factors on both sides of a debate, both arguments, could be very similar motivations, but just a different cultural or worldview that manifests each of those as very different looking things in the world, and people wanting to do different, solve problems differently and whatnot. But
that's so talk more about that. I mean, that was just like a 1 or 2 sentence throwaway at the end of a statement, but there's I feel like there's wisdom in that. There are nuggets in that for diversity, for equity, for inclusion, like for finding common ground, recognizing that our very different perspectives. What I'm hearing you say, you correct me, but I'm hearing you say like our very different ideas could actually be coming from the same, from the same place, just that we see it differently.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's cheesy, but I'll bring in a little metaphor that I like to use, which is, use the natural world as an example of, there may be a mountain peak, and a drop of rain may fall on one side of the mountain peak, and it goes 100 miles down to the ocean this way. But if that drop falls a little bit this way on the other side of the mountain peak, it may go 1,000 miles the other direction. So again, maybe not coming from the very different place to start with, but divergent in terms of application, or in terms of manifestation. What else could I say about that? Yeah. Let's redo that part. I'm sorry. What give me that lead in again to that little last nugget.
I actually thought it was a good answer.
I'm just stating it's like things can come from a similar place, but then show up in a different way. And so just being willing to sort of put down that, like, the other person is maybe from a different planet, and they have a totally messed up belief system. And of course we see this in politics all the time.
That's where I was thinking was right. We're all looking at the same picture, right? We're all looking at the same picture, the same economy, the same leaders, the same decisions, and yet we have such different, sometimes polar opposite beliefs about what we're looking at. And
I think people need to perhaps, or one thing that could be useful for a lot of people's thinking is just to kind of not have this sort of hard line choosing teams attitude, white versus black, red versus blue, whatever the thing is, there's so much nuance in life and in each of our lived experiences that we can each learn from. I don't think we all have to agree on every single darn point to be able to even collaborate, to work together, certainly not co-inhabit a neighborhood. I mean, all of our neighbors are all, different opinions and different careers and beliefs and everything. And somehow, well, largely it can work, in certain places it doesn't work, but I think becoming more flexible with our own opinions and our own willingness to listen. Listening is a skill, and it does take practice. And
I'm also hearing that being comfortable with discomfort or diversity or differences, and how have you learned to do that? So 39 people on the other side of the lens, just this one film, but I'm sure you face that all the time.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about when I was in film school, and one of my directing professors, I was actually going through I was finishing my senior film thesis, and I was super stressed. I was trying to get through my senior year and didn't know if I was going to graduate on time, of course. And there was conflict in my personal life. There was conflict in, with what I was doing with my schoolwork and everything. And I was having a really hard time. And one of my directing professors came in, and I went to see him, and he said, remember in film that conflict is what moves the whole wheel forward. It's the gas in the car, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a flat lake, it's a moving river. And so in that way, I sort of almost look at the theater or the stage of life in that way, like a film where conflict is sort of, it's this driving factor, whether it's natural change, whether it's the weather patterns causing change, whether it's the weather in ourselves causing change, and so it's sort of like reshaping my view of that to, okay, conflict and opposition are like inherent traits of, or inherent parts of our human experience, right? So why not lean into that? Why not learn from that when possible? Does that mean I never get frustrated? God, no. But learning to, at least in those little micro moments when you can kind of step back and try to reframe and say, okay, like what's really going on here, and sort of maybe there's a nugget to be learned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jesse, we talked a little bit before this about that nature demonstrates competition and collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And you do a lot of work in the environment of nature itself. And obviously businesses are looking for, at times, collaboration amongst teams, amongst people, amongst divisions, amongst whatever it may be. And they realize that there's also generally competition. Can you talk a little bit about more about, what you see in nature around competition and collaboration?
Certainly. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I would say, when you walk into something like a forest, say in my neck of the woods, literally in the woods, on the Oregon coast, it's chaotic. It's messy. There's a lot going on. And to the untrained eye, maybe it looks like, God, everything is strangling everything else, and on a closer look, you can really begin to see sort of all these things sort of need each other, and each thing sort of has a part to play. And it wouldn't be here nowadays, looking like it is, if that hadn't worked somehow, right? And I don't just mean like evolution theory here. We're just talking, these things have been here a very long time, right? Whichever way you frame it. And but that does not mean that competition is not in the mix also, right? Of course, that's everywhere. Creatures of a species are competing for food. It's a zero-sum game. Some get it, some don't. Is that bad? Is that good? No, it's the way the world works. But learning to be, I think as humans, I see a lot of people putting a value judgment on, collaboration good, competition bad. And again, I think that's sort of that leading into conflict thing that people can do, where you're not just framing something as just, oh, that's bad and it's competitive or whatnot. Because in company culture, in corporate culture, in creative culture, competition can be extremely healthy and can help people thrive in brainstorming and creating ideas, business models, and new ways of making money and doing good for the planet at the same time.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, I think it's a similar vein to like not learning conflict as inherently a negative force in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And anyone that doesn't believe me, I encourage them to take a walk in the woods sometime.
Yeah.
And take
and there's the seen and the unseen, right? Like, I'm always fascinated.
Yeah. I mean,
there's a network underneath the ground, like with mushrooms.
Exactly.
Right.
What I call the original internet. The way maybe a tree gets a pest, and it sends out a hormone through the roots, and that's absorbed by fungus or mycelium and sent through mycelial network to another tree that picks up on that message and can better prepare itself for that same pest. There's a very, very basic example of how ecosystem can collaborate. So what is the analogy in an office to mycelial messaging? Better communication, more transparency, collaborating, and some healthy competition too.
Yeah. I remember when I was coaching in 6th grade, it was a mixed gender basketball season. And the parents came up with the right idea that they wanted to take the scoring away. Right. So they wanted the kids to play without competition, without keeping score. And the powers that be said, okay, that sounds good. That sounds good and healthy. So let's do it. And every game, there was at least one person on each side that kept score and broadcast it to the rest of the team. in front of the parents who were trying to avoid whatever. But it reminds me of that. It became inevitable. There was a lot of collaboration, and the kids on the sideline were telling, there's a minute left and we're down 4. You couldn't blame the coach.
There's a motivation to be lost, maybe an excitement to be lost. I think competition inherently contains the idea of what's at stake.
Yeah.
And that goes back to people's personal commitment,
Right.
What's at stake and how am I a part of that, or what's my relationship to that? And am I going to be a change agent in relationship to that value or that thing?
Yeah.
So
that's really good.
It's also reminding me of competition is like I have to beat the other person as opposed to I have to just do better. How do I improve? How do I get better? How do I learn from? As opposed to how to beat. And we talked earlier about being reactive versus proactive.
Mm-hmm.
So there can even be competition in a proactive, that's healthy, right? That's keeping score in the basket. How do we get better? So we score better.
Yeah. And it goes to accountability, right? And that's like keeping score personally, and practice makes better. And how can we hold ourselves accountable and really do keep score in it, but in a way that's maybe helps gamify it in a little way, little ways and motivate ourselves rather than shaming ourselves for failures, seeing the gifts in the mistakes and the learning.
That's great.
That's a pretty advanced perspective, I must admit.
Well, I mean, it's something I think everybody strives for, but how many times is that a win personally? I'd say maybe half the time, but.
So we know that a lot of people are paying attention to being intentional and creating a healthy culture for the place where the organization, for the place where people gather and do a particular job. But we also talked about, there's this contrast between healthy thinking and toxic thinking, right? And if there's toxic thinking, or maybe it's just unhealthy thinking. How does that tie into this climate issue that we're all facing, whether we recognize it fully or not? Like from your perspective, doing documentaries, you mentioned to me you wanted to maybe have your next project be around forest management.
Yeah, I would say, the toxic, the only thing that's in that context that's one of the things that's the most toxic is choosing to have your head in the sand. And people can debate, I think people can debate science all they want all day, but I think generally most people know what's happening with the earth and with the climate. It's no longer as much of a debate as it used to be. And so I think we need to all move from that shared understanding. Again, toxicity, I think in this sense looks like making it highly political. It looks like coming at one another when we don't agree. It looks like cutting out whole perspectives and viewpoints just because we don't like what we're hearing. To me, those are the toxic parts of a debate like that, or debates. Back to breaking down stereotypes and listening to each other. So, with something like climate, I think we can deny all we want, for a long time, but you talk to farmers and their planting is wacky and different, and people are getting floods higher and higher up on their doorstep in places that are low elevation, and the weather is unpredictable. And so, I think the first part of the problem is, just kind of acknowledging what's happening, and then we can move from a place of understanding. If we're in a place of denial, whether it's solving a financial crisis at your company or solving a heating issue with your planet, we have to move from where we are and acknowledge where we are, even if that place really, really hurts to admit, to say that, okay, we've done this as a human species, but now what can we do? To come to terms, and not to stay stuck in the shame of all that either, but it also means acknowledging the past for what it was and moving forward from there. So.
there's another thing that interests me in this because when Patrick and Patsy and I are in and out of working with companies, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, people have used the language. So I think language is important. People have used the language of the war for talent, right?
The war for talent.
For talent, yeah.
Like
No, actually, it's actually framed as there's a war for talent, and we're losing the war, so to speak, when we can't hire enough talented people to run our business or our IT department or whatever the case may be. And then looking at one of the things I've been looking at is the carbon footprint for war, because there's a war happening right now, and
yes,
to know people in both countries. And given what you do, what I'm finding is I don't see or hear much about animals. I don't see or hear much about fish, water, insects, reptiles, other living things that are, severely traumatized or, impacted. And yet we're talking here in business about the war for talent. And I guess I don't even know what the question is, but it sparked that thought for me that you're what you're filming, what you're passionate about, what you're looking for is to bring, this perspective and these different perspectives together so that we can actually solve some problems. And it's so easy to ignore, I guess.
Well,
the impact of that kind of language, because if you come up to me right away and say, I know I know you're on the other side of this coin, and whatever, let's fight about it. We're just not dealing with some things here. So if I had the money, or some foundation had the money and said, Jesse, get over to Ukraine and really examine the true footprint of everything that's been impacted over there. I would be curious to see how you might approach that, and how does that relate to, we have a global economy now. I remember when people weren't talking about a global economy. It was American business, and there was business in the UK, but now we have a global economy. Everything impacts everything else. So I'm going to be quiet because I'm just going on and on.
But so I think at the core of it, this goes to sort of different levels of consciousness, and on the whole, as I see humans being extremely, some humans, a lot of war obsessed men mostly, being extremely concerned and with human matters and human matters only, right? And we've sort of othered ourselves from the rest of the world, and the environmental topics, the flora, the fauna get the back page of the paper, and that's not big news, right? So as far as the environmental impact of something like war, that is such the last consideration of world leaders who are doing things like that. So I just think we have a long way in worldly cultural evolution to be able to get to a point where we would automatically understand that is just not an option because of the sheer impact on our one and only home, our planet. But obviously, we are not there yet. So I think that's what I'm chipping away at with my filmmaking work, is trying to just close that gap a little bit and just say, hey, you know what? Actually, what happens over here in this little creek over here affects your home and affects you and your water source. Not to say the what is it, the butterfly effect or something, and the butterfly in China flaps its wings and my house falls down over here or something, nothing like that. But there are much more tangible relationships, and keying ourselves into those tangible relationships is going to help with that. And I think that, like we were talking about earlier about local economy and sort of keying in on like local issues, those are places where people can feel the impact of what's happening locally much, much more, as opposed to some far off economy or some far off decision made by a dictator. So, I think getting back to sort of the local level, sort of deglobalizing, not just things like supply chain and their customer base and the way we do business across borders, but, getting back into what is in my own backyard, what's happening here, how can and I don't just mean volunteering or picking up trash, but just even the smallest act of activism, just going to take a walk around the natural spaces in your neighborhood, taking stock of what's there, learning history, learning a little bit about what was there before. What did humans do to the landscape before you walked on it? How did they deal with it? And so understanding those sorts of things kind of brings in a more universal perspective of almost our smallness in the universe. And if we're not feeling like such big, chest beating apes that we want to play God, then maybe we're going to have a little bit more humility and treat the place a little bit better, I think. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it's reminding me of the similar conversation with CEOs and their organizations in terms of taking a systems perspective or a neighborhood perspective. You could say, I've got a neighborhood, I've also got a company. I just need to take a perspective, but I need to be curious. I need to ask questions. So I like how those two seem to be weaving together there. And
you keep mentioning systems perspective, Patsy, and it keeps sparking my curiosity. I spend a lot of time thinking about systems in storytelling I do, especially with governments and agencies and environmental systems and things. And I just want to say once again that I think so often in Western culture and Western thinking, we want to ask, well, what's the problem here? Is it this or is it that? What's causing the issue here, and make it a one topic thing. But again, zooming back and getting out of that blame game, and seeing, okay, there's a pre-existing set of conditions here, and the interaction is complex potentially.
Yeah.
And so, like in a broken economic system, like say a logging company has come through and employed people for a short time, but then cut all the trees and left no trees and no jobs left. There's a different way to do business, perhaps, that takes into account, is it the logger who's doing, is it the worker who's completely responsible, or is it the system for setting things up in a way that's built for unsustainable growth and externalizing costs to communities, to workers?
It sounds like that's what you were talking about earlier, or that's certainly an example of what you were talking about earlier. How about longer timeline in mind, right? Expand your timeline. That's short term objective, but the long term impact there is significant.
100%. Yeah.
I mean, the word that keeps coming to me is personal responsibility or accountability or awareness, even, because so much of what you're talking about, Jesse, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of unknowns for me as an individual that I will probably never understand.
Yeah.
All those different components, both historically and factually.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we can't all read all the history and all the research in the world and all the encyclopedias in the world. We have to rely on each other and primary sources and get the best information we can to make whatever decisions we can to live our lives. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the game, right? So
yes. I'm like, you had 2 years to dive into all that research and just kind of absorb yourself in that whole story. I mean,
it felt like a form of grad school almost, It's like re-educating myself. It was incredibly educational for sure. And I'm still not an expert by any means on any of those topics, but enough of, seeing what the opinions were and documenting them, and then trying to craft a balanced story that just serves those things up on a platter for people in a way that they can really digest.
Yeah.
hopefully with a little tiny bit of humor as well. Levity, which
It
all
always helps.
or would benefit.
I think when we work with leaders, we're also asking at times for them to understand the audience. So do you include that in the approach to like making the Chehalis watershed film? Because, you know, you've got
Yes.
so many voices and
Definitely. Yeah, great question. I mean, audiences, my understanding of the importance of audience is something that continues to grow with every film that we make. And, when I started, it used to be, okay, yeah, just make a thing and just whoever sees it, great. That's fantastic. Let's cast a big old net and we'll catch some fish, it's fine. And now there's so much, I mean, maybe that's one of the biggest areas of growth. It's just so much time taken to consider how the message is going to be received by different audiences. At the end of the day, we're making films for several audiences. We're essentially making them for people on multiple sides of whatever conflict is at the core of our story. So people can get informed and make decisions based on those issues and stories.
right.
So kind of losing my train of thought here.
Well, I have a question to ask into that, Jesse, that might help.
Yeah.
So is part of your job then to make sure that all these different voices feel well represented?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just there's a journalistic standard for like a broadcaster like PBS has something called the Red Book, which is sort of their set of journalism standards. So, there can't be any financial conflicts of interests. All the major sides of a debate have to be presented in an equitable, straightforward way, or at least a balanced way. And that guarantees certain things. But going back to audience, we're trying to make an artistic piece of cinema also. So there's this strange, at least in the environmental filmmaking niche that we're a part of, there's this sort of strange relationship and dance, even if you will, between impact and art, right? And of course, you say, well, art's impactful. People see it, and it's the whole point of art is to have impact emotionally, spiritually, whatever. But if you're talking about an issue-driven film where something is truly at stake in the world, whether it's a creature or a forest or something, that needs to be taken into consideration. So yeah, the idea of audience is huge, and you can't just, if you're looking toward the artistic audience, the film festival audience, it may be one type of movie as opposed to an issue-driven film, which could be a different type of movie. Ultimately, we try to blend both, and with mixed results. And I think some people wonder why one film isn't more one way or the other at times, but that's just all we have to swallow in terms of making these sorts of creations. But I will say that for me personally, the artistic aspect of it is what keeps me interested in the issues. What keeps the natural beauty and the awe of whatever we're filming, hopefully in the natural world, it's enough to make me care about the other stuff and keep going and keep the passion for it.
So I want to ask a question about a follow-up question about that, about understanding your audience. Because it's interesting when you said, and I think this is relevant to a senior leader, a CEO, who has different audiences that she or he has to communicate with, has to lead, inspire. It's interesting because when you said in the beginning, it was just tell the story and whoever sees it, sees it. But then as you start to think more about the audience, is there danger that by knowing my audience and wanting to, do you ever find, is there danger danger that you might start tweaking the story, veering away from just telling the story and more about trying to get a rise out of this particular audience? Like, let's go back to politics, right? Politics. Yeah. I know I can tell the economy story in one way to get a rise out of what we might call the left, or I could tell it the exact opposite to get a rise out of the right.
Yeah.
And so to me, is that, is that a struggle as you're telling the story? How do we not play to the audience, be true to the story? And then I think for the senior leader, what are some of the core values or the tenets that you relied on to make sure that you didn't do that? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like sort of like what we're talking about. I feel like it's like sensationalism and how to like avoid it and sort of,
Yeah.
And I do fight with that all the time. Actually, it's a great question because, sometimes we'll be interviewing someone and we'll strike upon a nugget of something that's just, for lack of a better term, just juicy drama.
Yeah.
And it's not productive to the story we're telling whatsoever. It's a shocker, and it might make people go, or it might make that person tell another person to watch the movie. But at the end of the day, the question has to be, does this move our story forward? And not just this story, but the way that we're trying to tell it. And, deciding from the beginning to tell a certain style of story that is true to XYZ, whatever those values are. If it's preservation of natural space, if it's giving certain people a voice, or both, or whatever, or presenting a debate in a fair way. That definitely comes into it. Is like, how do I not abuse the medium? Because that doesn't build trust. And building trust in cinema has to happen very, very carefully. And it goes even to editing choices. Am I going to throw a bunch of fast news clips together and try to get at your senses? Or am I going to like let something breathe and let people kind of be curious and lean in a bit more, which in my experience is, and it just depends on what you're after in certain way. I've done both things, in different times that were very appropriate for a film or a movie. But, and this is something that director, Shane Anderson and I work with quite a bit, is like, okay, what is over the top and what is kind of that more middle path where if people don't feel like they're being lectured to or told how to feel, then they have the sort of emotional volition to form it for themselves, even though we are guiding that, make no mistake, we're guiding that experience, but, which goes back to audience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems like what you're saying is knowing the what and why before you dive into the how you're going to do it. So it's going back to those values and, again, that audience, but it's something to continue to go back to.
It's definitely that guidepost. Yeah.
Because I've been inspired by one version of what you're talking about, and I've been subjective to the other version. So, and I don't like being subjected. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that can transfer. That's a transferable skill directly to corporate leadership, or culture creation, not slamming things down people's throats. And even in personal leadership, like we have a very small remote team that we work with. Right, I don't own a giant company. It's like we have distributed freelancers, and it comes down to even how we schedule things and how we work and what we ask of each other and how we do it, and we're trying to create that more healthy culture of an interconnected, synergistic, and healthily competitive body of creative people, so form that little ecosystem.
That's good. Any other questions for Jesse before we get practical?
I have one other question. And it's around communication. Your film is relatively long in time, and people talk about you only have a certain amount of time now to communicate and tell a story or make a point. And some of that seems to be driven by, technology. Or, I don't know, I'm not a big TikTok person, but they're little short little things, and they move, they move and are maybe viewed by a lot of people. Just any thoughts on that in terms of, we've got leaders here trying to figure out not only their audience, but how much time they have for their message.
Well, I will say that these days it is harder and harder to get people into a theater for an hour-long, hour-and-a-half experience. People love movies. They love going to the theater, but sometimes documentary can be a little bit of a downer, you know?
Mm.
So oftentimes we are asked either by press or if we're working on a commercial project or something for a client, you know, we'll have maybe the film is 15 minutes long, the main piece, and then we'll do a 2-minute version. And then we'll do a 30-second version.
Mm.
And yes, a 10-second version. And so it's like, okay, is the message powerful enough to where if you contain it down to a grain of sand, does the essence still come through? And there's no sure shot answer for everything with that, but that's the challenge. That's the bid that we give ourselves, is how can we cut toward that goal and still have the essence survive. So I think as long as people are focused on that, the medium can change forever, and it will always change. It'll go to 5-second videos. It'll go to 1-second videos. And then eventually we're stuck back at photos, right? And a photo is 1,000 words. So I think whatever the nugget is, there are ways to be effective messengers and communicators. Even though, I fight a lot with the short form content. You know, I like to sit, I like to watch the long movie and have my experience with it and everything. But I think it's a skill, we can all learn is how to get more succinct, which, in business pitching is a great skill to have, to be able to condense to get that nut graph, to get that the elevator pitch, right? That's the smallest form of your business plan right there. So, and that exists in a form that is expandable out to a whole, business plan fully fleshed out and everything. So
that's a great way to say it. Think about it.
What's the nugget?
Good. Patsy, any more from you?
No, I think that's a great one to close on.
Good one to end on. Awesome. All right. Well, so listener, this is the part of every show where we try to give you practical things that you can do in your business to make inroads in the areas that we've talked about today. So, Jesse, we'll let you go first so we don't take all the good ones. What are some practical tips that you'd have for the frustrated CEO?
Yeah, I will say one of the first ones is, just questioning assumptions about question everything, question assumptions, and certainly questioning stereotypes about others and what assumptions we go into situations with. Good. Any others? Let's see. Well, one I didn't mention is, which I've had a tremendous amount of success with or help with, is find a good mentor. And this goes to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Don't go it alone. It takes a team. It takes a village, right? But specifically, see a trend toward mentorship sort of going away in our culture, and I want to fight to bring that back and to maintain that, because it's some of the most powerful learning I've had. So, beautiful. How did you choose a mentor? Well, in the case of I'd say most mentors I've had in my life actually after them proactively. So I would say don't feel a ceiling between yourself and people whose work you admire. People can tell if you're serious and if they've got any sort of, if they're in the collaborative spirit, if they're able to, I think people will always sort of want to lend a helping hand, no matter how small. And I also try to pay that forward as well. I have people reach out to me, young filmmakers all the time, who maybe just have a quick question, or maybe they're alumni from UC Santa Cruz, where I went, and they have questions about, how do I jumpstart my career? How do I gain experience and relevance in the world? Mm-hmm. So, that's good. Important. Good. Awesome. Well, we'll circle back to you at the end, give you an opportunity to throw anything else that you might want to add to the list. Patsy, would you like to go?
Sure. The one I'm looking at right now is give every stakeholder a seat at the table. Yep. And be wise enough to listen to each person's voice.
Yep. I had that one too.
Mm-hmm.
And since I've mentioned this word a number of times, Jesse, you'll appreciate. Keep your curiosity alive, even in those moments of discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Well stated. Yeah, great.
One of my favorites. So,
yeah.
And the last one for me is conflict is what moves the wheel forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had that one too. Yep.
There's a lot of different wheels. So,
Yes.
Yep.
okay.
Leb, you want to go or you want me to go?
I'll jump in and hopefully leave you some good ones. One is build common ground wherever you can. Just look for what we might share in common. Another is understand your core values as you're addressing different audiences. Be true to yourself and recognize it's not really about you alone. And I love the notion of lengthening the timeline. Skip a generation, skip to 7 generations, and see what information or other thinking might come from that. Because we have a tendency to really shrink it down and get really immediate about this quarter or that quarter. And I'll do one more, which is create multiple lengths of time to tell a story. And I love what you said, Jesse, about to think of your elevator pitch and then expanding to your full business plan.
Yeah.
So I will stop there and hand it to you, Patrick.
Beautiful. You left me a few. That's good. All right. Awesome.
Yay.
Okay. We led with.
This is it.
You did. Who knew? I see. You didn't know you were full of so much wisdom, did you, Jesse?
You skillfully drew it out.
There you go. So let's see. You led with, and I like this. Leadership comes from nowhere. That at the end of the day, the motivation and the passion has to come from within. So it kind of piggybacks what you're talking about, core values, but you've got to find it inside. I had Jesse. You said this. I thought it was pretty spot on. One of the more toxic things you can do is keep your head in the sand. So, as a CEO, whether it's about the environment or whether it's just stuff going on inside the organization, internal debates, issues, don't ignore or deny what's going on. That just leads to toxic culture. And the last one I'll add is I loved that whole conversation about audience, and just be careful not to sensationalize or manipulate the story just to artificially move your audience. Collect the data, tell the story, stick to the facts, and then allow people to form their own conclusions. I wish more of that was going on in all of our media today.
No doubt.
So, Yep. Good. Any others? Jesse, now that we've all gone, we always circle back and give anybody a chance to add any more.
Well, maybe to bring in an old 60s adage, maybe think global, act local. So any way that you can engage boots on the ground with what your subject matter is, the more connection you can have to that physically, face-to-face with communities involved in what you're doing, the more effective you will be as a leader and as a storyteller. So,
nice.
I got two more.
Oh, wow.
One I thought, Patrick, you'd nab for sure, because we rely on you for this. A little, maybe a lot of humor is useful.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And then the other one, kind of the flip side, they're both flip side, is we'll never be able to understand everything. So we have to rely on other people.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
That's good.
Definitely.
I've got one more. We act on what we believe, and core beliefs matter, and at times they need to be re-examined.
Oh, is a good one.
Yeah. Back to that curiosity. Turning the curiosity on ourselves and not being afraid to re-examine and just evolve and be malleable.
Well, then I'm going to add one. Patsy, since you invoked my name, I'm going to invoke yours. You actually said competition isn't always about beating the other person. It can just be about being better than you were yesterday. Right.
Yep.
Which I thought was
excellent.
Good. It's good. All right. Jesse, how can people, first of all, how do people find your documentary?
Yeah, so everything, all my film work is on my site, jesseandrewclark.com, just my first, middle, and last name.com. That's sort of a jumping off point.
Okay.
Happy to provide listeners with any links if you guys do those on your podcasts.
We do. Yep.
And yeah, that's sort of the main thing. So, and then of course, the film company that I work with predominantly with Shane Anderson, another director, is called Swiftwater Films.
Okay.
And that website is swiftwaterfilms.com. And I can also provide you with that link as well.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, so please do, because we'll get all this posted up onto our website, The Frustrated CEO, which is where you'll find this episode, as well as this episode's companion, Let's Get Practical. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate that.
Appreciate all of you. Leb, Patrick, Patsy, thank you. Really pleasure to be on.
It's really been great. Yep.
Yeah, Leb or Patsy, anything else?
No, just thank you, Jesse. That's really provocative. Really, really great.
Pleasure's all mine.
Good stuff. All right, listener, thank you for sticking with us to the end of yet another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. Please connect with all three of us or any one of us and the show. We're all on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in being a guest on a future episode, contact us there. We'd love to hear from you. I think that's it. So we'll see you again next time on the Frustrated CEO podcast.